Welcome to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. I'm your host, Deputy Editor Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with Professor Manuela Consonni, who is a leading scholar of Holocaust history, memory, gender, and post-war European culture. She is currently the director of the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Antisemitism at the Hebrew University. And we are here to speak for Yom Hashoah, the Israeli Holocaust Memorial Day, about a new exhibition that is going up at the Hebrew University. So, Manuela, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Amanda.
It is such a pleasure. And as I said, we're going to speak on Yom Hashoah about the new exhibit, The Faces of Women's Resistance in the Holocaust. And we'll hear all about that and more when we're back. Manuela, first of all, I want to just define some terms with you before we get into the new exhibit. And what is essentially resistance? And especially when we're talking about women during the Holocaust, what is the definition of resistance?
Well, let's say that in historiography, there are different types of resistance. There is civic resistance, but resistance or resilience, as is very much used, gets different type of definitions. You know, for women, resistance in the camps, that was kind of a position to a system that was trying to not only to dehumanize them, that was true also for the male experience. That is to say, gender is also a category that we use in order to speak about men. The fact that we are giving a space to speak about women, it results a kind of particularity. But it's true that for women, resistance was opposing and surviving in the camps. But that is true, as I said, also for men. If we get out of the camps, it depends how much was the consciousness of the individual developed. So you could have a resistance of a political type, and also a kind of civic, as I said before. For example, and I'm bringing a kind of field of study that is very familiar to me, because I wrote a couple of books on the matter, and was the resistance made by soldiers after the fall of fascism in 1943. That was that they decided 650,000 soldiers decided to enter the concentration camps and not to come back home, because they refused to obey to the new diktat given by the Repubblica Sociale of Salò after the fall of fascism in 1943. This is a tremendous type of resistance. Resistance was the help that not Jews gave to the Jews during the Holocaust. All this kind of differentiation that brings together a picture that in the exhibition that you were mentioning, that this year is devoted to women in different types of work, like soldiers. So there are Chaviva Reich and Hannah Senesh, but also doctors. Edith Stein, for example, is remembered in this exhibition. And we decided, I must say, that we came up with this idea together with Moreshet, that is one of the first places where there was Abba Kovner and Chaika Grossman, and to have something devoted to women. And they came out with a proposal for us to have a exhibition. And we are having it together with the cooperation of the Bloomfield Library of the campus in Mount Scopus. And we decided that also the day, tomorrow is the opening, but in the afternoon we have also a symposium with three young, very amazing scholars, I would say, and very much into this discourse of the women, the female body as a field in which the enemies exercise his power.
Okay, so before we get into that a little more deeply, let me just say back to you what I think you said to me, and that is resistance can be on many different levels. Obviously, it can be armed, it can be political, and for Jews, and perhaps especially women, but definitely for Jews, just the mere survival in the camps or at all under the Nazi regime is resistance.
Absolutely.
And this exhibit that is being launched on Monday, we're recording on Sunday. And of course, we're releasing this for Yom Hashoah this week on Wednesday. So in this exhibit, we have different examples from all different walks of life of women. We have the soldiers, we have the medical care, we have even, I would assume, mothers. And at the same time, you're having a symposium on the campus at Hebrew University. So for anyone who hasn't been to the Hebrew University, the building in which this exhibition is being held is a bit of a maze. And I myself always get lost in it, no matter how many times I've been on the campus. And for anyone who has navigation disability like I do, it's a bit of a problem getting there. But if you do make it to the Humanities Library, usually these exhibitions are just outside the library in a bit of a...
At the entrance, at the library, I don't know if you are familiar with the kibbutz of Givat Chaviva, and Moreshet is in Givat Chaviva and is the organization of the Shomer HaTzair. For example, after October 7, they are collecting as well testimonies from the kibbutzim of the Shomer HaTzair. And we decided...
Let me just interrupt you for some terms. And Moreshet is, of course, heritage in Hebrew. So it's a heritage foundation, meaning collecting the heritage and oral testimonies and things of that nature. Shomer HaTzair is a youth movement that has been active even prior to the Holocaust, and in fact was really instrumental in bringing many, many, many from Europe to Israel before the Holocaust. So they escaped, of course, the Nazi regime.
And I want to add that in Moreshet, Israel Gutman and Yehuda Bauer, they were leading scholars. You know, they were asked by Abba Kovner to be part of the... And maybe something, a curiosity that not everybody knows, but Yehuda Bauer is born as a military historian and was in a conversation with Abba Kovner that asked him, this is not the most important thing that you can write about. So he said, why don't you write to this formative experience? You know, it's like a Bildung experience, is even more than that. That was the experience of the camps, of the Holocaust in its broader sense, on persecution and the deportations.
And just to pause right here, Yehuda Bauer is, of course, one of the foremost Holocaust historians. He died, I believe, last year or the year before, very recently, and he was much beloved of the historian community. I want to move on a little bit more into the themes of the women. And Manuela, I don't know if you know this, but I worked for about a month in the Vidal Sassoon Antisemitism Center. I was a secretary for about a month, and we realized that I'm really not a good secretary. And so I left and returned to journalism. But when I was there, the breadth of work is just amazing that is taking place in the center. But the focus on women, I would say, is somewhat new in a way. Wouldn't you agree that within the past at least 20 years, this is something that is evolving? So how are you in terms of focusing on women? How did you get started in that?
I want to specify, I dealt with gender, and I wrote, I have a chapter in my new book that is speaking about women. And because it's always puzzled me, this idea of talking about the experience as an experience that, if we should be precise, I would say that we are talking about 6 million of people that live differently with their body, their own experience. That would be the most accurate definition. But certainly there is a worries, concerns that I came across with, especially with the written testimony. With the oral testimony, it was more complicated because and here I'm moving a bit forward to compare not the quality, but the fact that, for example, women were harassed and were raped also in the camps. But the sexuality of women in the camps, it was never discussed, as was not discussed the sexuality of men in the camps. We know that they were separated. We know that they were, especially in the block, in the place where they were, the capot that were leading the block, there were interactions, but nobody ever really spoke or in details about that, and there are good reasons for that. There is a kind of pornographic gaze on the experience that it should be avoided to go, I believe. And for example, only very late it came out this discomfort that women felt to take showers, not to have to take showers, to take off their clothes, and all this was done in front of Nazi soldiers. That they were bringing them in, and they were naked. So there was a broken of conventions. At the first place, it's not only a part of the dehumanizing process, but soldiers that fought in the First World War, it's quite likely that they were having a kind of experience of being together that was quite different from the one of women, that they were not in the army. So this kind of disclosure of the body, that was immediately the first things that was happening. It was a hard situation. Women that arrive in the camps pregnant, for example. We have all the book that Germain Thion, that was a French partisan that was in Ravensbrück, that we know that not only the gas chambers, but we are also talking about abortions that were taking place. I mean, women, the periods, the menstruation, there were particular things that only women could experience as such. And also the violence. So not only we decide to have an exhibit that was bringing together Jewish women and not Jewish women as well, because at the end of the day, when they were into the camps, living in Ravensbrück between the partisans women, the French women, the Polish women, or the Italian women, their correspective, their companion, their Jewish companion, they did not really felt differently. There was a kind of camaraderism that it was bringing people together. But so it puzzled me, this idea of the typology of suffering, of pain that they went through. And while, for example, when we starting to collect testimony after October 7, if you remember, immediately this aspect of the sexuality came out. And it came out for women and for men, but certainly for women more as a redundancy that it was related to the experience, that did not leave many survivors out of it. So there's a difference in time. I interviewed myself 180 survivors for the Visual History Foundation, and only at the end women they could address this kind of field that it was felt as improper, filthy from the very beginning. There were lovers of men, there were lovers of women. There were a very complex situation. And so this year, for the Yom Hashoah, I decided that we should go through the women experience. We should deal that women and men in different ways suffered. We should deal with subjects that are remain to the periphery because they are difficult subject to confront with.
It's interesting to me when you think about the faces of the Holocaust, and the face that comes to mind to so many different people is actually female, and that is Anne Frank. And of course, she symbolizes so much the innocence and the, perhaps in a way, also passivity in her resistance, meaning she was a child. She was taken to a place by her family. She wasn't the active one. And yet, in charting her story, she has charted a resistance that we would never have known about. And I wonder where this kind of paradigm fits in with what you've been seeing in terms of resistance from women specifically. She, again, was a child, but her mother also made the decision to go into hiding, which is a huge act of resistance. So talk to us a little bit more about perhaps even mothers in resisting the Nazi regime in order to help their children survive.
Well, mothers that help their children to survive. There is this huge number of families that they send their children away. I mean, they send them to Palestine, they send them, they separate themselves from them in order to give them the possibility of surviving. That they would be even in hiding. Many, let's say that not only in Holland, but also in other places, there is this hiding. And there is this exemplary story of Anna Frank. Anna Frank, she had a kind of reflection of her experience, in particular at the end, before they were caught. That is quite amazing what she says, talking about her own sacrifice. Now, I'm not quoting her correctly, but she says, if this experience would teach the world and others something, then I'm prepared to go through it until the end. That if we think someone that if she was 14 and a half, this kind of awareness of the importance of what we could have learned and what we could have benefited from all this evil. And I must say that reading of what is happening now is quite astonishing, that we arrive to the conclusion very often that we didn't learn much. We should have known better. And but it's impressive, this kind of, even more than her sister. No, their sister was in another age, more older. But Anna Frank had this understanding of history, I would say, that it was beyond her own experience as a person, as an individual experience. But what would remain of the history of the Jews after this experience, saying, if we will not learn from it something, and posing yourself on the front line and say, I'm prepared if it will be worth to do that.
Right. But at the same time, she had such an innocence in her, meaning I don't know what happened after she was captured, obviously, but she wasn't one of those, as far as we know, who was raped.
No, not at all. She was brought in Bergen-Belsen and she died a few days before the liberation. Yes.
Right. And so she had one experience. And as you said, there were 6 million experiences throughout this, and at least half of them women, most likely. So how do you make some kind of general blanket scholarship from studying the women's experience? Or do you just completely see it as every single person had her own experience?
No, I was quoting Pierpaolo Pasolini, that is in a book that he came out posthumous in 1976, Petrolio. Is a kind of book made of aphorism, and is referring to the Jews, to the small bodies of the Jews. And he says that every experience that we live in this world is through the body. There is not something that we can only experiment through our mind. And the things of the survival is not only a psychological aspect of the surviving. You need a body to survive. You need the integrity of the body. If you remember what Primo Levi writes about the Muslim, the Muslim is certainly a medical figure in the opening of the camps. There is a kind of etiology of the typology of illness that they develop. But there is also an aspect that destroyed the body in a very rapidly, if you want. The Muslim was a physical condition that it was related to a psychological dimension for sure, but it was a physical condition in which the body could not come back to itself. And in this sense, you do generalization on a typology of experience that women passed. I work mostly with women that they were in the camps. And there are different roles in the camps. Women doctors, women that they were, organizing themselves. So there are different groups from the different, for example, if we spoke about Holland, in the statistics, it was quite interesting. Men from Holland died quicker than women, for example. Because they were not, they didn't have the habit, Again, Primo Levi writes about it and says, the people the Jews that came from Italy, they didn't know the hardship of the ghetto of Eastern Europe, of Poland. So they were not prepared to this attack on their humanity. And they didn't know how to react to it. But again, the body was a central place in which the experience went through. When I said 6 million, it's because I think that each of us, in illness or in other situations, we do live differently. None of us live in the same way. There are common traits, maybe, determined by the experience itself, in the camps, in the hidings, in the fights, for example, in the way in which you decide or you solve your resistance to evil. It's quite, a difficult subject to talk about in our days.
And I want to turn to our days, actually. And you touched on this earlier in terms of comparing or mentioning at least the suffering of the women on October 7th and the sexual abuse that they experienced. And of course, now, or at least any time one of the hostages have been released in recent months, they come out and they look like this Muslim that you were describing, and they look like somebody who barely survived the Holocaust. And you said earlier in our conversation that it appears that we as a society, we as humanity have not learned that much, have not learned the lessons from the Holocaust. I wonder how you feel about these comparisons between the survivors who are hostages to the survivors of the Holocaust. Do you feel like this is a kosher thing to do, even to make these comparisons between the two very terrible experiences lived by these Jews?
Well, you ask complicated questions, because we are talking about the Holocaust was before the creation of the State of Israel, when the Jews were minorities in Europe, and where the Jews were persecuted and where they were deported and were killed. Now, the semantic that has been used in order to transmit the image, I would believe. Well, they were, physically speaking, in particular, there were the three of them, the one that we saw them release, they were looking like. But this is a kind of image that is dear to us in one sense, and is very familiar to us. So it's a kind of default of reading it, no? It's not so surprising that people do compare and they say is like a kind of Holocaust. I don't think that is a kind of Holocaust. I think that was an attack on inflicting the death. Then in the way it was decided to inflict to the Jews the death, that was that they decided, that Hamas decided to apply. It could be different. It was not. Now, to compare this to the Holocaust creates a kind of misunderstanding on the differences of context, on period, and on the fact that we are a sovereign state. We are not a minority at stake, and that everybody can attack. I think that the mixture of things that came out after October 7 and after the war that is still going on in Gaza, it doesn't have a clear cut to say, in order to explain what happened, we are going to say that is a kind of Holocaust, or it certainly is antisemitism. I would be more careful in using this terminology because it creates a backdrop of on feeling or alimenting fears and with no hope, for example. And I do feel that in this moment of our history, of human history, we need to have hope, not to be optimistic, but hope is the things that we need to have.
I mean, it is, of course, the name of our national anthem, and we as Israelis are resilient people and do pin ourselves to our national anthem and Hatikva, the hope to continue and to see the Jewish people flourishing. I just want to end with one final question, and it's, again, this use of terminology. And, of course, there were Holocausts before the Holocaust, and there are survivors before and after our Holocaust survivors. And so I just want to ask you, do you think it is apt to use the term survivor for those who did survive October 7th?
No, survivor is the right word. Survivor, we use it also for survivors of a plane that is crashing, So it is a survivor. Survivor is, by the way, is very interesting, the etymology of the word superstite. No? All this discussion that Agamben deals with on testimony, for example. What is a testimony? A witness. In Latin, you have testis, no? That is like martirio, shaheed in Arabic, that you bear witness. Because you are the person that actually survived. So superstite comes from superstare, to be above and to look and to be able to see what the other do not see. So it means a kind of eyewitness in a sense. So they survive an experience of attack on their humanity. It's not that it does not exist, this aspect in the hostages, but that has been, I would say, that this is an experience that is also in the war that we are waging. We are attacking humanities in a sense, no? So who survived the war is a survivor. Who survived the Hamas prisons in the tunnels is certainly a survivor. And who survived the Holocaust is a survivor. So certainly survivor is not a word that I would deny to use in order to speak. I would not use the word Shoah. Shoah is something that we still have on our shoulder, and it looks like that we have, with great difficulties, be able to get rid of, to have another experience of life and not of death.
So just to take things, to close the circle on our conversation, to bring it back to the exhibit, of course, which is about resistance. And as we said at the beginning, surviving is a form of resistance. And so, of course, all these hostages who are let out, they are survivors, and they are also resisting in every single breath they take. And may we see many, many more resist and survive in the near future. So Manuela, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for inviting me to speak about it. I'm very glad. Thank you.
Pleasure is mine. Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.